Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic in June this year, the provision of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued in the context of full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Information from governments about their transfers of weapon systems and ammunition is available through open sources. These transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircrafts, helicopters, large-scale artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms, and light weapons and their ammunition. Over the last months, reported transfers of arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian Defense Forces have expanded. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed combat aerial vehicles and ammunition, to the Russian armed forces for use in Ukraine. I would like to emphasize here that reports related to the transfer and the use of cluster munitions are very concerning. Spokesperson of the Secretary General has called for these types of munitions to be consigned to history and not to be used. The influx of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict can contribute to the escalation and presents significant risks of diversion and proliferation even after the conflict has ended. Measures to address the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized uses are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such measures include enhancement of marking practices, comprehensive pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end user certificates, including non-transfer clauses, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications. To prevent the diversion of weapons, supply chain transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states is required, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting and comprehensive record-keeping practices, physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, customs and border control measures, and diversion monitoring and analysis. Transparency in arms transfers is yet another confidence-building measure, which can serve to reduce tensions, ambiguities, and misperceptions between member states. The UN Register of Conventional Arms remains a key tool in this regard. To prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have also established a number of arms control treaties and instruments, including the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument. I take this opportunity to commend the work of the Open-Ended Working Group, OEWG, on conventional ammunition and applaud the successful adoption of its final report containing the global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management. The framework is a much-needed instrument to address both the safety and security risks associated with conventional ammunition to prevent diversion and unplanned explosions. I call on states to consider joining relevant treaties and agreements and to fully implement their legal obligations under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, as well as their political commitments to minimize the risk of diversion of arms and ammunition. Mr. President, beyond addressing arms safety and security risks across all stages of their life cycle, including arms transfers, all parties to the armed conflict have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. The impact of intensifying violence on civilians remains an area of great concern. From 24 February 2022 to 13 August 2023, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 26,384 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with 9,444 killed and 16,940 injured. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including by shelling from artillery, tanks and multiple launch rocket systems, cruise and ballistic missiles, and by airstrikes. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm. I take this opportunity to refer to the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November 2022. It falls on member states to implement the declaration in a broad and meaningful manner. The continued and intensified attacks against critical infrastructure and services, including energy infrastructure, health, and educational facilities, ports, roads, and bridges are alarming. Mines and explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture while impeding the movements of people. I encourage all relevant parties to abide by their obligations under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and not to transfer or use any mines prohibited by its amended Protocol 2. Under international humanitarian law, parties to an armed conflict are prohibited from targeting civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infrastructure, and have the responsibility to take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid, or at least minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The United Nations strongly condemns attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and calls for their immediate cessation. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the Russian military offensive in Ukraine, in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. It is imperative to put an end to this brutal war. I appeal to all member states to make every effort for peace. The United Nations stands ready to support all genuine efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace to Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, the international law, and the relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank